Well, this morning, friends, we're going to do this slightly differently than we normally do. Our reading for today is a rather long one, and so I'm actually going to do it a bit of pieces at a time during the message. But I also want to do some introduction on the front end to all of this. Today is Consecration Sunday, and to consecrate something means to give it to the Lord for God's will to be done with it, to give something over to God so that God's will would be done. This morning we were just singing a little while ago, O come, Emmanuel, God come and be with us. It's this cry as we gear up for Christmas coming. Our hope is that God will come into our lives in a powerful way and change it, that God will come and do something. And this connects very much with the setting in the reading today. In the book of Daniel, the Israelites are in exile in the land of Babylon. They have been taken over and hauled away from their homeland. Jerusalem has been destroyed. And the Hebrew people in Babylon are having their culture and their faith systematically destroyed and torn apart. So much so that the three figures we meet today, names you might have heard, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have actually had their names changed. See, the names that we find them in here are their Babylonian names, that all are names that honor the Babylonian gods. They had names before that were Hebrew names that honored their God, and the Babylonians were so set on destroying their culture and their faith that they said, you can't keep those names that you have. We're giving you new names. We're giving you names that honor our gods, not this fake God that you used to worship. And so they have had everything that's important to them systematically destroyed, torn apart. They're living in this foreign land. And in today's reading, they are challenged to decide whether or not they will stand with integrity to what they believe or whether they will bow to the pressures of the gods of their culture. Now, we're going to get into that, but let me tell you a little bit more than connecting with what Francine was saying and how all this works on Consecration Sunday. First of all, today, many of you, our mission partners, received in the mail a giving intent card. Even if you're not a mission partner, you're invited to fill one of these out if you would like to. But today, we bring these forward to consecrate them to the Lord, to say, God, for the next year, this is what we feel we are being called to consecrate to you, for your will to be done in our church and in our community. And so later today, when you come forward for communion, you're invited first to stop at the baptismal font and mark the cross on your forehead, reminding yourself that you have already been consecrated to the Lord. When we are baptized, we are consecrated to the Lord. That is set apart for God's will to be done in us, in our lives. We are set apart. So come forward and remind yourself that you have been set apart. Remember last week we had our ninth graders were confirmed. When they were confirmed, they were commissioned in their faith, reminded that they had been set apart, reminded that now they are to live out that mission that God has for them, for God's will to be done. So we come forward this morning to remind ourselves that we have been consecrated to the Lord, and then to offer these gifts. And so there's a basket here. You may place your card, if you have it with you today, to place it in here. If you don't, you may send that into the office at any time or bring it by whenever you'd like to. These help us in our planning for the year. But come forward to do those things and then to receive communion as you go back to your seat. But one more then bit of explanation about what this is exactly. So we have been on this incredible journey here at New Heights to grow into the church that God is calling us to be. And we've been talking about being sustainable, being a faith community that is sustainable in a way that we can carry out the mission that God has for us. And that has multiple pieces. One piece is the future building that we'll be moving into. And so earlier this year, we had our Shine Appeal. That Shine Appeal is all about funding that future mission outpost, that future building we'll be in so that we can do God's work. That is a separate thing from this. That is an altogether separate thing than what this is. This is how we as a church keep the lights on, how we as a church pay for staff to help lead our ministries, how we as a church keep the parking lot plowed in the winter. Those seem like sort of not very interesting kinds of things, right? They seem actually kind of boring kinds of things. But I want to challenge you today to keep in mind that what you give in our regular giving is your gift to God so that God's will can be done here and in our community. And so God's will is done as we as God's people gather together, are inspired in our faith, and then live out our faith out in the community. And so what we've been challenged to do as a church over these last 11 years is we've continued to expand God's impact. We've expanded God's impact by who's here on Sunday morning, by who's here on Wednesday night, but also in the staff that God has called here to lead all of that ministry, right? And the way that we've been doing this as we've added pieces is we've gotten grants to help fund the addition of those pieces. Because full-time employees are expensive, let's say, right? And so in order for us to appropriately honor those folks for their work, our giving is important to help make that happen. Well, this year, our final grant runs out. So first we had a grant that helped us get Jane's position, and then we got a grant to help us get Ben's position. And we have continued to grow every step of the way, but now we're to a place where if we want to have those staff, if we want to have a pastor, we have to be able to pay them in a fair way that honors their work. So understand that these gifts, as you consecrate them to God, help God's work to be done in this place and in our community in powerful ways. And a big part of that is so that we have staff to help lead those ministries and lead us. So that's what this is about, saying, God, we want your will to be done here and in our community. This is what we're called to give so that can happen. I want to mention on a set-aside piece then, Francine brought up the Heights Unlimited challenge this morning. Just to clarify for everyone, Heights Unlimited, a ministry born out of this place, is self-sustaining. None of our budget right now goes to support Heights Unlimited. That's something we would like to financially support Heights Unlimited, but as we are still in this growing phase of making ourselves sustainable, we are not yet at a place where we can financially support. Now, if the giving comes back in our giving intent cards in such a way that we can support Heights Unlimited financially, we would like to do so. We need to get there. So Heights Unlimited is in a place where all of their funding has to come in from outside sources. Much of that comes from you all, but also other people in the community. And as we heard Francine say, a former Black Earth resident who lives in a faraway state was so excited to hear they were giving to make that happen. So just to be clear, those are all separate giving opportunities, separate ways for you to be generous. Giving to Heights Unlimited, giving to our regular ministry fund, giving to our Shine Appeal. From a pastor's perspective, our giving starts here so that God's will can be done in this very basic, important way first. And then we give over and above to the Shine Appeal. We give over and above to Heights Unlimited. Those are extra givings that we do after we have first given what God calls us to give in this place, okay? So my last piece about that. Biblically, we understand that God calls us to think of our giving in a way that is around a tithe. A tithe is 10%. 10% of what we give goes back to God for God's will to be done directly. Now, over the last few years, I've been challenging you to up your giving by 0.25% or by 0.5%. When I've challenged you to do those things, Ann and I have also done those things. And so when we started at a tithe at 10%, we're now up to 11% of our income is what we give to the regular ministry fund. 11% of our income we give there first. We give to the Shine Appeal over and above that. We give to other places over and above that. And for us, that is how we are faithful in living out our faith. That's how we are faithful in responding to what God's done for us. That means that we can't always do all the things we would like to do. That means we can't always do the things that I see on Facebook everyone else is doing. Okay? That means we don't always get to have all the kinds of things that our culture says this is how you find life. But I'll tell you what, we have abundant life. We have very abundant life because our life is in Jesus. And so today, as you hear this reading from Daniel and as you consider how God is at work in your life, I want you to ask that question, what does abundant life look like for me? And the big question is there integrity between what I say I believe and how I actually live? Particularly, is there integrity in what I say I believe and what my checkbook looks like? Is there integrity in those things where my resources go? So, that was a great big lead in there, wasn't it? A lot for us to think about today, my friends. A lot for us to think about. And above all, for me, at bottom line is what you are called to give is between you and God. That is for you to talk with God about. And however the Holy Spirit moves you, please give in that way. And we know here that families are all in different places, at different places in life and in different situations. So we ask you to give in a prayerful way according to how God calls you. But let's look at this reading then this morning from Daniel. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 young Jewish men living in Babylon, have actually been specially selected into positions of leadership in Babylon. Now, they are friends with Daniel. Many of us probably know Daniel better than we know these 3. But all 4 of them were friends, and all 4 of them had been recognized by the Babylonians as young men of integrity, young men of talent, young men of intellect, who they could put in charge and would be effective, good leaders. And so in this reading today, we find that there's all this pressure to follow the culture. There's all this pressure to do what the culture is doing, to do what everyone else is doing, to follow what everyone expects you to do, and most importantly, directly, to worship the gods of the culture. So let's start into this, and then we'll stop along the way. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn and flute and zither and lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Anybody saying, tattletales? Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Now let's pause there for a moment. This is serious business. Okay, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego live in a place where they are cultural prisoners, essentially, right? They have been hauled away from their homeland. They've been made now to live in this place, and they've been made to assimilate to this culture, so much so that even their names have been changed, so that they will forget where they came from, they will forget who they are, and they will become, well, a good Babylonian. And now they are being commanded to bow down to this golden statue just like everyone else, or face these incredibly great repercussions. So put yourself in their place for a moment. And what is your response when you are faced with this king and you have, look at what they have to lose. They've actually been put in positions of power. So they actually have a decent life, so to speak, compared to a lot of their people. What do you think you do in this moment? What do you do? I don't know about you, but I'm thinking about a way I can get out of it, right? How can we kind of work the system here so that this doesn't have to be a deal? I mean, really, if everybody else is bowing down, what's the obvious thing to do? Bow down. I mean, couldn't you bow down and at the same time be saying your own prayers to your God? They wouldn't know, right? The obvious thing, from my perspective, is to bow down, for crying out loud. And they're not being threatened with losing their job, their pension. They're being threatened with losing their life. Now, in the context, how are you and I commanded, let's say, by our culture to bow down to the gods of our culture? And what really is there at risk for us when we're called to do so? But here's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response, verse 16. They reply, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, We want to make clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Okay. They weren't very subtle there, were they? They were not subtle at all. There is integrity between what they believe, what they say they believe, and their actions. There's integrity there. There's no compromise. So what happens? Verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nobody says no to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nobody. He always gets what he wants. But they've said no. He was so furious that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace, and he shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." How did he just address them? Servants of the Most High God. Well, that's a sudden change, isn't it? Wow. Suddenly, he is saying to them that they are servants of the Most High God. You see, as they have stood for what they believe and they've stood with integrity, God has been glorified in an incredible way. But let's see what else happens here. So they stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Wow. Wow. Now, understand the ultimate ramifications here. See, up to this point, it was dangerous for them even to say the name of their God. They couldn't in any public way worship their God. They couldn't in any public way practice their Hebrew belief system. And now, what is he saying? He's saying not only is it safe for you to do that, but anybody who speaks against you, against your God, well, they're going to be the ones who are in big trouble. So now all of their people, all of the Hebrew people are now able to practice their faith openly. They are now able to worship the God that they serve because of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's step of faith, their integrity, their moment here of standing their ground. Incredible. Now, as a side note, isn't it interesting the violence in this culture, the violence of this king, that, you know, his new edict is if anybody says anything bad about their God, well, they're going to be torn limb from limb, right? I mean, you get a sense of, honestly, this man was a maniacal, evil person who wanted death and destruction and always got what he wanted. So what an incredible, incredible thing that happens here. So friends, there I think is a lot for us to think about in all of this. And what an odd text for Consecration Sunday, right? What an odd text. And yet I think there's some really important things here for us to hear and for us to consider. So let's start with this issue of worshiping the gods of our culture. Now clearly in this instance, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they face an obvious moment of choice. Which is it going to be? You going to bow down or not? That's it. You choose. But we're all going to know right now. In our culture, it's much more subtle, isn't it? It's much more subtle. But let's start with the question, what are the gods of our culture today? What are the gods that we serve? What would you say are the things in our culture that call people to put those things as the highest things in their lives, as the most important things, as the things that are our greatest value or will give life? What are the gods in our culture? Cell phones, right? Technology. Okay, and what is it? It's somehow this device makes life more fun and more interesting and more exciting. And whether that's the game we're addicted to or whether it's the social media that we can't get off of, right? Did we get enough likes today? Do we keep our snap string going, right? All of the, tell me what's the word for it? Streak. Not on Snapchat. And most of you aren't either, so I know you're laughing at yourselves, right? Okay. Isn't that interesting? These little devices that we spend a whole lot more time on than we spend talking with our God. Bottom line. We also might spend a whole lot more money on them than we actually give to God in the offering plate. If your monthly phone bill is higher than what you give to God, you might want to just have a conversation with God about that. Okay, what else? Anna? She said, keeping our children involved in activities and sports. Now, as we talk about all of these gods in our culture today, I want you to hear that we're not saying all of these things are bad things. Okay? Our cell phones they make life a lot better, and there's a lot of good uses for them. The activities and things that our kids are in, these are wonderful things. The point is, where's our priorities, and to what level do we raise things? Right? One of the hardest things about being a parent today is there are 1,000,001 good things for our kids to be involved in. And we want our kids to get all the best things possible. And so, of course, we want them to be in this and be in that and be in that other thing. Why wouldn't we? And yet what happens? Those things so run our lives that we don't have time for actual family conversation. Those things so run our lives that we can't be in worship on Sunday morning or at Family Faith on Wednesday night because we have practice and we have games and we have places we have to be. More important than our relationship with God? Well, when we ask it that way, of course not. But in reality, yes, they are. They are. Wow. Right? Where's the balance? Where's the balance there? Okay, what are some of the other gods we worship in our community? What's that? The dollar bill. Money, right? I mean, isn't that the biggest god of all, the dollar bill, money? I mean, the number one thing, the best way to happiness, we all know, is to get more money. Get more money, you will be more happy. You will be happier. Your life will be more fulfilled if you have more money. And not just enough in your hands, but enough put away for later. Yeah. What else? What are the other gods that we serve? Our homes. I'm grateful for the beautiful home that I live in. I'm very grateful for it. And I know that you are grateful for your homes. But my goodness, if our grandparents saw the homes that we live in, what would they be saying? What would they be saying? I'm not looking for a smaller house, by the way. I mean, right, you guys get, like, when we have these conversations, I'm in the middle of it too, right? I'm talking to myself as well. Okay, what else? What else here? Ourselves. I mean, our culture says the number one way to happiness, the thing you need to worry about more than anything else is yourself. Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Are you getting your needs met? That's the most important thing. And if you focus on yourself first, then everything else will work out. Oh my goodness, is that a lie? That is the opposite of what Jesus taught. The opposite. It's the biggest lie in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't take care of ourselves. That doesn't mean that we let ourselves be doormats. But our one way to happiness is not thinking about ourselves first. The abundant life that Jesus talked about is a life of selflessness, not selfishness. That's where we find fulfillment. That's where we find abundant life, is when suddenly our lives are no longer about, am I getting what I want? But about, how can I do God's work in the world? How can I do the work that God has called me to do? Yeah, yep. Our jobs. We'll start with Ginger. Our jobs, right? I mean, isn't that what we learn? It's status. It's status, it's power, it's position. What's the title in front of your name? How many people report to you? How many people do you have control of or power over? And the way that you make a way for yourself in the world is the title that you have. It's the paycheck you receive. That's what matters. And how many people dive in headlong into careers while their family at home disappears, right? So easy to lose our way. Brett? So I'm not going to repeat all of that. But actually, Brett said something in the middle that in a very, I think, good, important way kind of connects all of this. And he said, how do you cook a frog? You don't drop it into boiling water. You just let the water slowly warm up, and it doesn't realize it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And essentially, ultimately, that's the difference between the society that is in Babylon and our society today. Okay, these men faced a moment where it was boiling water. It was boiling water. They knew it, and they chose to jump in, but they knew it was boiling water, right? We're sitting in warm water, and it's getting hotter, and we have no idea because it's just slowly warming up. Right? It's just getting warmer, and we get farther from God, we get more self-absorbed, more focused on ourselves, we get more off track, and we don't even know it. And that's so in many ways why this is so dangerous. Now, let me say one thing clearly. I think we live in the greatest country in the world. Our freedoms, I think, are freedoms that God intends for us to have. This is a great country. There's a difference between our country and our culture, okay? And what we see in our culture is the natural end of human freedom. The natural end of human freedom is that we are sinners, and we become selfish, and we care about ourselves more than others. That's who we are. That's what we do. And that's why God's gift of salvation is so important to us. Because without God's transforming work in our lives, we are doomed to that end, to that selfish, self-absorbed end. But God comes to us in the midst of our selfishness, our sinfulness, and says, you're mine. I claimed you. I died for you. You belong to me. And if you let me, I will change your heart and your mind. If you let me, I will lead you to abundant life where you no longer follow the gods of your culture full on, but rather become who I intend for you to be. Okay? But it is so difficult in a culture in which we are completely submerged all the time. Advertisements everywhere. TV, radio, social media, and all of these things conditioning us to think of ourselves first. All of these things conditioning us to go where our heart's desire leads us. Now let me share with you another passage and some words that were in my devotional this week that I think were powerful. So many of you have heard this. It's from Matthew 6. Jesus is speaking and he says, listen, store your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. And this is so important. He says, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. Wherever your treasure is, and that is wherever you invest the most of yourself, well, that's where your heart will be. Okay, now let me read the words from my devotional this week. The writer says, if we incessantly think about and mentally pursue the things that this world puts value on, we communicate to God that the things we choose to focus on are better than the things God has for us. Okay, let me read that again. if we incessantly think about and mentally pursue the things that this world puts value on, we communicate to God that the things we choose to focus on are better than the things God has for us. Right? Now you can ask yourself how true that is for you. And the way I talk about this is I use the word thought life. What is your thought life like? What are the things that you tend to spend your energy, your mindfulness thinking about? Right? What kinds of things in our lives get us excited, and do we devote our time and energy and resources to? Because that will tell us ultimately who it is or what it is that we worship. See, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they faced that moment where they had to choose whether their actions were going to reflect what they said they believed. And theirs was a crystal clear moment to do it. We don't have that kind of crystal clear moment. But my question to you is there integrity between how you live, that is, how you spend your resources, your time, your talents, your treasure? Is there integrity between that and what you believe? Said another way, if we were to go through our bank accounts and look at our spending for the last month, who or what is the God that we're serving? Who or what is the God that we're worshiping? See, for me, that's where the rubber starts to hit the road, right? Because many of us are probably worshiping our favorite restaurants more than we're worshiping God. Sorry, Dana. Right? Or we worship our favorite sports team. How many hours a week do we spend thinking about if we're going to win the game this weekend? And how does that time compare to how much time we think about how good and awesome and mighty God is and how much we want to live out God's will? We could all just stop right there, right? We get the point. See, what Jesus is talking about in that Matthew passage is that where we tend to focus our energies tells us a whole lot about what we worship. And when we consider what Jesus had to say about abundant life, what we discover is if we want that abundant life that God has for us, it comes when God becomes the most important thing in our lives, when our relationship with God becomes central, becomes first, becomes number one. Now, sometimes we need to discipline ourselves to help ourselves get there. Sometimes spiritual disciplines are a result of God's transforming work in our lives. So, for instance, you may have to discipline yourself into a daily devotional routine to help you get to a place where you find yourself talking with God every morning and throughout the day. Or you may be at a place in your life where you have been doing that, and now suddenly you don't have to think about whether that's something you're going to do. You do that as an outflow of your relationship with God. You can't wait to get to that time in the Word, that time with God each day. So we bring this around full circle. And I ask you today, is there integrity between what you say you believe and how you actually live? How you spend, how you use the resources God has given you? Is there integrity there? I'll tell you, for me, I told you earlier that about Anna and I's giving habits, and I'll tell you, it's important for me spiritually that I start with that giving first. Okay, we give electronically because that helps me to give what I intend to give. I promise to God, this is what I'm giving to you, and then I don't even consider that as income, my own income that I can do something with, because it's not mine, it's God's. And by starting in that place, that helps me to be more spiritually healthy. It helps me to say, you know what? I don't need that trip. I don't need that new thing. I don't need that other stuff over there. I don't. Of course I don't. But I easily think that I do, especially when I see that everyone else has it or is doing it. So I have to say to God, I'm going to give this to you first so that I can follow through on my intent here, so that I can give to you as I intend to give. And hopefully that helps me when I get to moments like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where my actions will match up with what I say I believe. because I'm trying to practice that in a real, honest way. So ultimately then, today we consider that question. Is there integrity between what we say we believe and how we actually live? Do we really want God's will to be done in this church? Do we really want God's will to be done in our community? Do we really want to see this place be all that God intends for it to be? If we do, then we have to release the resources. We have to trust God with those things to make that happen. We do. Without God's people releasing the resources for those things to happen, they won't. They can't. We won't be able to retain the staff that we want in this place unless we're releasing the resources to do so. That's a simple fact of the matter. We can't support financially places like Heights Unlimited unless our people release the resources for that to happen. Right? Friends, we have an awesome God. Here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they respond this way with the promise that someday God will send the Messiah to them. Right? They're in exile. They're not even responding to God's goodness right in their lives in the moment. They're living in this terrible place. And they're saying, God's still first. And we're still going to live in response to who we believe this God of ours is. You and I, we live in the land of greatest freedom. We're more affluent than any other people at any other time in history, and we're not sure we want to trust God with those things. We're not sure. And yet we get ready for Christmas saying, O come, Emmanuel, God, we want you to come and save us. Well, do we believe that? Do we believe that God has come to save us? Yeah. So friends, we prepare for Christmas, and we offer our prayers. And then we remember that Jesus has come, and he's come to work through you and I so that God's work is done in the world. That's powerful. That's awesome. That's what we're a part of. Let's pray. Almighty God, thank you for challenging us today with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their witness to us. Thank you also for coming to us in our sinfulness and our selfishness, and still loving us and saving us and claiming us. Thank you for coming to us in the midst of all the ways we turn our backs on you and don't trust you, and just welcoming us home. You welcome us home, and you bless us, and you love us. And so we pray, God, that you help us to continue to follow you. Help us, Lord, to embrace the calls you put in our hearts, in our minds. Help us to be your presence in this community and in this world the way that you intend for us to be. Because, Lord, as we cry, O come, Emmanuel, we pray that your will would be done in us and through us, that you would be glorified in all that we do. It's in your name we pray these things.